Hello everyone, I'm Christian Lundblad, finance faculty at the Kenan-Flagler Business School and Director of Research at the Kenan Institute of Private Enterprise. I want to talk a little bit about the Federal Reserve. It's obviously been in the news of late. And of course, we very recently had, for the first time since the financial crisis, a significant shift in the policy stance where we have a 25 basis point rate cut. And so that has generated some controversy. It's really along a multitude of dimensions. Let's talk a little bit about the here and now, and then get to the larger question about central bank independence. So the controversy emanates, one, from was this the right technocratic move given the economic fundamentals that prevail in the United States? Secondly, some of the controversy emanates from the fact that the messaging coming from the central bank was a little bit murky. So they could have done a better job, I think, in managing expectations. And then finally, the cut follows a stream of complaints, let's say, from our president's Twitter handle that make it look as though the Federal Reserve is responding to political pressures. And I specifically want to talk about that towards the end. But let's get a little bit to kind of the traditional complaints at the outset. So point number one is about really the technocratic merits of this call at present. So first off, the U.S. economy is doing okay. We have, relatively strong consumer confidence. U.S. overall economic growth continues to do reasonably well, as it has on the back end of the financial crisis. The unemployment rate remains at a near record low. So from that perspective, it looks almost a little bit premature to be cutting rates at present. But of course, well-meaning economists and business leaders can kind of disagree. And one of the things that has generated some consternation, let's say, is economic weakness that's emanating from other parts of the world, so obviously Europe and China. The trade war clearly has been a problem. That's obviously generated some challenges, and global trade has indeed been on the decline around the world. And in fact, the most recent print on GDP that we just got, one of the signals of weakness that showed up over there had to do specifically with capital investment by the corporate sector. And some of the anecdotal evidence there is that really is a kind of paralysis that's being engendered by trade war considerations. So that is there, from that perspective. I personally am relatively skeptical that this is the right call at this point in the business cycle. But again, to be clear, well-meaning, folks trying to read the tea leaves to figure out exactly what's going on can unambiguously disagree about whether this was or wasn't a good call. I think one thing we can say, and that gets to point number two, is that even if this were a good call, even if you sort of appreciated the importance of doing a rate cut at this stage in the business cycle, the messaging has been relatively poor. The Fed has not done a particularly good job of managing expectations among market participants. So as an example, before the meeting, there was a kind of well-followed speech by the bank president at the New York Fed. It shocked market participants, frankly. They started to revise expectations, suggesting a 50 basis point rate cut might actually be on the horizon. And then the New York Fed quickly walked back that in a rather uncharacteristic fashion. And the Fed funds futures market, which kind of tracks market participants' expectations of where the Fed is going to go in subsequent meetings, was impossibly volatile over that horizon, quite stunningly so, in fact. Additionally, after the meeting, the most recent rate cut, the Fed chair had his press conference, and in that setting, the language was a little bit murky. So some suggesting that maybe this was a kind of one-off rate cut. Market participants and indeed the financial press really over the course of that day was kind of struggling. They were a bit bemused, to be perfectly honest, about what exactly was the takeaway from that meeting. I mean, where we stand right now, those same Fed funds futures contract markets, again, the ones that kind of prognosticate about where the Fed might be going, they're looking for a couple more rate cuts over the course of this year. But I think the Fed has to do a much better job in kind of managing the language, managing their messaging to help form expectations appropriately. Those are pretty normal, though. Like, we can disagree technocratically about whether this is the right call. We can complain a little bit about the Fed's messaging, but this is a little bit like the traditional punditry, and it's a little bit like us kind of complaining about an umpire and their correctness in calling balls and strikes. But we don't ultimately, at the end of the day, challenge the umpire's authority and question whether it is that it's appropriate for them to even be calling balls and strikes in the first place. And that gets to point number 3 that I find incredibly distressing in the current political climate. Political influence cannot be part of a central bank's operational decision-making, period. There's a very sort of distressing movement that's taking place throughout our political landscape that is challenging or delegitimizing the arbiters or the institutions or the folks that are tasked with ultimately deciding what is truth or who's in some degree of authority. And that's bleeding into Federal Reserve independence as an example of that. The Fed, in fairness, does and should face some political oversight. That's unambiguous, and the Fed does. So the nominating process is conducted through elected leadership. The Fed officials have to sort of march down, with some periodicity and have to present, and defend their moves in front of Congress. There should be some oversight, and I'm not suggesting otherwise, but the technocratic day-to-day process of managing monetary policy, this has to be independent, and that is well supported by the historical record. So in a now famous paper by Alesina and Summers back in 1993, they showed that central bank independence, looking at data from all around the world, different central banks in different countries, they showed that this promotes price stability. So in those countries in which the central bank had greater degree of autonomy, inflationary pressures were relatively muted. Numerous research efforts have taken place since then to kind of largely corroborate that evidence. And I would say really almost up to the financial crisis, kind of the view of central bank independence was, other than a few Fed skeptics, let's say, sort of generally viewed as the perceived wisdom. And indeed, over those kind of decades, central bank independence increased all around the world as a consequence. But then we hit the financial crisis, and something just really fundamentally changed. It's almost a watershed moment that kind of challenges our accepted wisdom about a lot of different things in the policy arena, and the Fed is one of them. I mean, questions were raised about the Fed's role in even promoting some of the excess leverage that led to the financial crisis explosion in the fall of 2008. And secondly, I would say there's questions that were raised about the merits of the kind of unconventional policy that ensued, whether it was zero interest rate policy or the Fed kind of making uncharacteristic promises to the marketplace, trillions of dollars of quantitative easing, and kind of the alphabet soup of all of these different backstops that the Fed put in place at the heat of the financial crisis. I mean, traditional Fed skeptics who had kind of always wondered about the effectiveness or even the constitutionality of the Fed were then joined by a lot of Americans that were kind of wondering, like, who the Fed's interests really were. What was the Fed, trying to do from that perspective? And so let's talk a little bit about that and then kind of get to the here and now that I find distressing. So number one, is the institution constitutional? There's nowhere in the Constitution that offers a role for technocrats that kind of get to have such sway over the U.S. economy and hence her citizenry. That's true. Nevertheless, we have a Fed. It's not going to change. So let's leave the constitutionality aside for the moment. There is an interesting philosophical debate that has raged forever about the efficacy of monetary policy. Like on the one hand, some skeptics simply believe that it is too difficult to conduct policy in this way, and the unintended consequences will swamp the intended consequences of macroeconomic stabilization. And that's a long-standing debate. It's been around for centuries, almost at this point, certainly. On the other hand, there are those who say, look, if we have a tool to help Americans who are suffering, we ought to use it. And Keynes actually used the word barbaric to suggest it would be barbaric to do otherwise. This is a fascinating, long-standing philosophical debate about the very idea of a central bank in the first place, tasked with kind of managing macroeconomic stabilization. At the end of the day, it's almost a little bit academic, right? We have a central bank. It's tasked with macroeconomic stabilization. It's tasked with macro and micro regulation of the banking system and all sorts of other things. We have a central bank. It's tasked with these things. So kind of wherever you are on that philosophical debate, At the end of the day, we've got one, and so we ought to make sure that the institution in its current incarnation is independent, period. I mean, we can argue about the technocratic merits of the current policy stance. I am deeply skeptical, as I said earlier, about whether this is the right call for the central bank to be kind of conducting at this time. But it is necessary that this is separated from some kind of politically motivated juicing of our economy. A central bank's greatest asset is its credibility. I mean, we have to believe that they're conducting operationally their tools in concert with their mandates. We cannot believe that they're responding to the political machinery. I mean, the alternative is that if we grant a greater role to elected leadership to conduct monetary policy, and this can come from any faction, any political party. There's nothing particularly special about the current one except its kind of continued haranguing, if you will, of the central bank to try to move in a more politically motivated direction. I mean, we have to believe that monetary policy determination is separated from that elected leadership, or ironically, we may realize exactly the fears of the greatest Fed skeptics. I mean, if the central bank becomes an arm of the political machinery, then that sows the seeds for the ultimate debasing of the United States currency. That's the irony. So central bank operational independence is critical. Again, to sum up, simply put, if we have a Fed, and we do, so in some sense that invalidates some of the traditional debates that go on out there, we have a Fed. It must be operationally independent.